federal government's long-awaited and newly unveiled oil and gas sector emissions cap that was first promised in 2021. Ottawa says it will impose its cap through a national cap-and-trade system, taking effect at the earliest in 2026. But the targets are less aggressive than expected. The goal now is to reduce total emissions in the sector by 35 to 38% below 2019 levels by 2030. Last year, however, in the government's emissions reductions plan, the feds had set a target of 42% below 2019 levels. Meanwhile, oil and gas producers will have the flexibility to emit up to 20 to 23% below 2019 levels by either buying carbon offsets or paying into a fund that promotes decarbonization. Plus, draft regulations won't be published until next year. The announcement also comes on the heels of two recent Supreme Court decisions that went against Liberal climate policies. One opinion said the Fed's environmental impact assessment for big projects like pipelines stepped into provincial jurisdiction, while the other struck down Environment Canada's designation that all plastic manufactured items are toxic. So, are the feds confident these targets are constitutional and will actually come into effect? We spoke to Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault from the UN's climate conference in Dubai, where he made the announcement. Hi, Minister. Good to see you. Thank you for making the time.
My pleasure, Vassy.
Your party first promised the cap back in 2021. It was to include then a 2025 requirement. The form and timeline of the cap then was to be communicated in early 2023. Now you won't even release the draft regulations until the middle of next year, and the cap doesn't take effect until early 2026 after the next election. Why would you risk this not happening?
It did take a bit more time to prepare this than we had initially anticipated, because it's a first in Canadian history. No government has ever put in place regulations to ensure that the oil and gas sector reduces its overall pollution. It's never been done. And in fact, not only has it never been done in Canada, we're the first oil and gas producer in the world to do that. And I've been talking to many of them here in Dubai at COP28. And it's so unique that the COP28 president put out a publication congratulating Canada for doing that.
The same president who runs an oil company?
The UAE is a large oil and gas producer, not quite as large as Canada. The president is in charge of the oil company. He's also in charge of the renewable energy and clean technology company, which is one of the largest in the world. So it's not black and white.
Well, I want to ask about that because especially where the timeline is concerned. I take your point that this is new and novel, but it is something that your government was unequivocal about. In fact, in the press conference during the campaign in which the Prime Minister made this announcement, he pledged that the emissions from the oil sector will no longer rise. It'll decrease every year. He did very specifically say that there would be some target in 2025. This is just so far off that. And like I said in the initial question,
it's not so far off.
No, it is, because there's no 2025 target. The first target available is 2030.
It's going to be 2026. The regulation will enter into force in 2026, so a year later than we had initially anticipated. And if you compare to other regulations we've put forward, whether it's on vehicles, 100% of cars sold in Canada will have to be zero-emission vehicle by 2035. Electricity, we want to have a carbon neutral grid and net zero grid by 2035. So in fact, we're earlier in the timeline compared to other regulations when it comes to oil and gas.
Is the delay here just because it is new and it is novel, or is it because you're worried about the recent losses in the Supreme Court and you wanted to make sure that didn't end up being the case this time? And are you sure it won't be?
Yeah, it did take more time because it's novel, because no one else has done this on the planet. But obviously, we're not impervious to what happens in the world, and the Supreme Court opinion, because it wasn't a decision, as you know, Vassy, on impact assessment. We wanted to take the time that was needed to ensure that we had all our ducks in a row. But we also did a lot of consultations with provinces, with companies, with experts, environmental organizations, indigenous groups, to make sure that what we're putting out there is reasonable. Like, we want to achieve a reduction of pollution, of course, but we want to do this in an economically and financially sound way. And the Supreme Court said the federal government can intervene when it comes to fighting climate change pollution. But we have to, it's not an open bar, and we have to make sure we stay in our areas of jurisdiction. And we've worked really hard to ensure that we do that with this piece of regulation.
And how sure are you of that? And the reason I ask is because I knew that I anticipated that you would probably point to that decision around carbon pricing, and understandably so. And I read it very closely because someone had flagged to me that the language is very specific about sort of how Chief Justice Wagner spelled out where you are able to go where you haven't before. By that I mean, because climate change is such an imperative and because the risks associated with it are, and through the POGG, the federal government has the ability to impose that regulation specifically. But it said the matter is limited, and I read it very specifically, to GHG pricing of GHG emissions, a narrow and specific regulatory mechanism. Are you sure the regulations that come with this cap are in line with this decision, or we know it's going to be challenged in the Supreme Court? Can you be sure you'll win?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing. We're putting, a cap and trade is a different mechanism to put a price on pollution than carbon pricing. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. We're putting in place a mechanism that's tackling climate change pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and not the production of oil and gas. And we're doing so through a pricing mechanism, just like the Supreme Court said we should be doing. I imagine that this will be challenged in the court. I mean, Alberta and Saskatchewan challenge just about everything we've done when it comes to fighting climate change in the courts. It's, we can anticipate that this will be no exception.
Do you also anticipate that the targets, as you've now set them out, and we still don't know exactly all the regulations associated with them, as I pointed out earlier, we won't until next year. Do you anticipate that it will be enough for the federal government to reach its targets in 2030? And I ask because our audience will be familiar with the conclusions the Auditor General's office released very recently, which is that the plan as it currently exists is not. And it actually pointed to the cap as something you should have placed a higher priority on earlier.
The Commissioner to the Environment didn't say anything that I haven't said myself a number of times publicly, that the plan we have is a good plan, and it brings us closer to our 2030 targets, but we're not there yet. And the cap is an important element of this, but it's not like we've been sitting around fumbling our thumbs when it comes to fighting climate change. So I think we're doing a lot, but we're not quite there, and the only way we get to meet our 2030 targets is if we continue systematically every day working to fight climate change pollution, which won't happen under a Pierre Poilievre government. We'll go back decades in terms of investment in public transit, in clean technologies, in home energy retrofits. All of these things fly out the door, but we have a shot at meeting our targets for the first time in the history of Canada. And in fact, the plan that we tabled last week in the House of Commons showed that we will meet our 2026 targets. And it would be the first time in the history of our country, but we need to keep going at it.
And certainly, Minister, look, with respect, I understand. I'm not trying to say or insinuate that the federal government has done nothing on climate change, but my job is to measure your performance against the targets that you yourself set out, and I have the metric of what the commissioner put forward, which is that those targets won't be met based on what he's seen so far, and based of a lack of priority on specifically this emissions cap, which we now know will be delayed beyond what you initially promised. I take your point around the Conservatives and a lack of a plan, and that's my job to ask them questions about that. I guess I'm confused about the defense. Like, they don't have a plan, so we shouldn't look to be critical of yours?
Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that we've put forward a number of measures to advance the fight against climate change in Canada. The plan that we tabled last week in the House of Commons says that we're 90% there. The plan that we tabled last year said that we were 85% there. So we're getting closer.
But that's not there.
I'm the first one to admit that we're not there yet. We still have 6 years ahead of us to get there, to make more investments, maybe to put forward more measures. But we're not there. And I agree with that. We're getting closer and closer. And the last thing we need is for a government to come in place and throw all of that out the door. Then, of course, we'll never get there. But if we continue, I'm confident that we can achieve our targets. But the operating word here is continue fighting climate change.
Okay, Minister, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vassy.